Hey, you did you know that in the United States alone, there are over 24 different dialects of the English language spoken? Now, I know that might sound wild, but when you're a third culture kid like me, my mother's background is Swiss and Dutch, so I have a lot of Amish and Mennonite relatives. And then my father is part Puerto Rican. My grandfather came to the States, to Chicago in particular, when he was about 16 from the island of Puerto Rico, and met my grandmother, who was an orphan from the hills of Kentucky, has some different native bloodlines as well, but a lot of Scottish heritage. So then my parents get set up on a blind date and get married at 19, and you have me. But I'm reading one of my dear friends, Mariela Romero's book, and it is the first book that I'm attempting to read that's completely in Spanish. I am not a fully native Spanish speaker, nor is it my first language. However, I have often been shamed over the years for being part Puerto Rican and not speaking Spanish, right? So this is a very common thing that happens. I want to also take a moment to remind us all that only about 4% of the world population is made up of people from the United States. So I want to point that out because often in the United States context, we are made to believe that, we are the only narrative that matters, or we are often fed things by the media, which are just not true when it comes to the global population. So I'm here to share just about my own upbringing because I've been told many times how unique it is. And I grew up hearing a lot of Dutch and Spanish, but not mastering or speaking either language fully, but being able to master the English language, which is a gift and a privilege. I say that because as I've been making my way through my friend's book, I realized, what a challenge it is to already learn a language. The place where I become conflicted is actually the fact that I'm a former K-12 teacher and principal. I still work with K-12 schools. I put out a lot of resources for teachers and principals in particular. Where do we start to have a better understanding that it's like students don't need to be corrected for how they speak? How I've always felt about it is if you understand what someone's saying and you can get to common ground, why does it matter? I pointed out the beginning fact of this video of having over 24 dialects of English spoken in the United States alone, because, for example, if I meet a person from Boston who is born and raised and has a very thick Boston accent, then that's going to be very different than a conversation with a person who is born and raised in New Orleans. It's going to sound different. Apologize for the sirens in the background, and whatever's happening, we hope you're okay. We lift you up right now. Okay, so back to this. Another thing I want to point out about language, and these are just pondering of questions, during my coffee time before I start writing. But one thing I want to point out is how do we start to differentiate between having this idea of whether it's Spanglish or using different words as generations change? Gen Z and Generation Alpha, they kind of have their entire own lingo. I'm a millennial, Gen Xers, as well as baby boomers. We all have our own type of lingo for the generations, just like there's certain types of music, that really drive each generation. The reason I want to point this out is because now, at this present time, there are so many of us, Latinos in particular, Hispanic origin people, and Hispanic has to do with your language, by the way. It's different than an ethnic group, which is Latina, Latinx, however you prefer the terminology, Latino, Latina. But I say all this to say, it's interesting to me how language changes. I love observing it, but there's still this dissonance in a lot of K-12 schools about how English should be taught, the reading, the writing, the listening, and the speaking. And it's just worthy of having continued conversation. I want to point out an example, though, too, as to why English, if you're a person who's learning English and you're struggling to master it, why it is actually one of the most difficult languages in the world to learn to read, write, listen, and speak really well. And so I always try to remind myself and other educators, every student who comes to preschool or kindergarten in our K-12 systems around the world, they are a learner of that language. So in the States, they're a learner of English, but it's different if I'm coming from a different country and I haven't had any exposure to English, right? My learning curve is going to be greater. One of the major differences with English language, and I want to remind us all this, especially maybe you're a parent who's trying to help their kid read and your kid is struggling. First of all, let them go at their own pace. every child's brain develops at different rates, and our frontal, like our prefrontal cortexes, they're not even done developing until we're like 25 or 26 for decision making, right? Like, and those just different things developmentally happen differently for all of us. But I do want to point this out. One example is, so Spanish language, if I use the term correr, for example, it's a verb, it means to run. That word means to run, correr, okay? In English, I could use the word run like, I'm going to run to the store. My nose is running. I'm going to go for a run at the gym. Are you going to run and pick the child up from school? Like, I could keep going, but this is just one reason why English is actually quite tricky to master. And then, of course, the different types of pidgin English around the world, Spanglish, different variations, that just keeps growing and growing as so many of us are a rich tapestry of lots of DNA and culture. So just a good morning to you all from our patio as the sun rises here. You hear some birds and you heard some sirens earlier and what have you, but getting ready to do some writing. Let me know what you all are doing this morning and any comments or thoughts you have about what I've been pontificating about today. Take care.